Very good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold Segawa. On the agenda tonight is African democracy in retreat. The end of the Cold War in 1991 saw democracies flourish across many African countries. But in the recent years, there are signs that autocracy is making a comeback, with democracy being put on life support. Our guests will drill down on this worrying trend. In South Africa, the drought is taking a huge toll on the country's agriculture, with the industry asking for $220 million for emergency relief from the government. We will look at the impact of the drought on one sector, which is the ostrich industry. But first, one of the takeaways from the World Economic Forum held last week in the ski resort of Davos in Switzerland is the rise of automation and artificial intelligence and its impact on the job market. Here are some of the thoughts from a Davos discussion on our brave new world.
Is this something we should be worried about?
Yeah, absolutely. We should be worried, but I don't think we should be panicked. Right? There were people in the 1800s who were terrified about all the horse and buggy driver jobs that were going to disappear. The reality is cars created lots of new jobs along with eliminating lots of old jobs. And I think the same thing is going to happen with job displacement today. If you look at the world economy and what jobs are growing fastest, there are two categories that are really picking up steam. One is STEM jobs, of course. So in the US, 5 of the fastest 10 growing jobs are actually STEM jobs.
And STEM jobs are?
Software developers. We have huge demand expected for solar installers, wind turbine engineers, people who work with science and technology. The other half, though, are service and care jobs. So the majority of GDP and jobs in the industrialized world is actually the service sector, not the knowledge sector. So home health aides, nurses, teachers, huge demand. And so I think those jobs are really hard to automate. I did love watching the Jetsons growing up, but I don't think we're going to have a home health robot anytime soon.
And so that sounds great. If we can all train ourselves to be software developers, we'd be in great shape. Christy, though, we have a lot of people who've worked for a long time in very specific jobs. Retraining is difficult. These are often jobs that require high education. What's the responsibility of corporations to help people transition to this?
Well, my organization represents 20 million workers in the service industry. So many of the occupation that you've described, home health aides, but also in the retail sector and the finance. And what we see is that the jobs aren't really disappearing, they're changing. So the specifics of the jobs are changing, and the corporations have a responsibility to kind of give them on-the-job training to go through that process of upskilling and reskilling. And that for the most part, that on-the-job training is taking place. But there will be some that are left behind that can't be upskilled or reskilled, where the jobs disappear. And we see that quite a bit in the finance sector right now, finance, banks, and insurance. And here we think we need tripartite solutions, really. There will be people who are displaced. And so the question of unions, business, and governments coming together to have labor market policies that make sure that as people navigate the change, there is support for appropriate reskilling, as mapped out what are the skill needs going to be, involving industrial, the employers to be part of that process. But we think the best way forward is a tripartite lifelong learning approach to be worked out, involving all three. And there will be need for that, and corporations should take their responsibility.
And what is that responsibility, Julie?
Yeah, look, I think that if you step back, there was research released this week that said there will be job displacement. 10% of the jobs or so are going to go away. 90%, to Christy's point, are going to be different, interacting with machines, whether it's robots or AI. And organizations need to prepare their employees to do so. And look at the tasks that are going to be no longer part of a job, the new tasks that are that need to be incorporated. I think organizations today do invest in their workforce. It's an important thing to do. It's a competitive advantage for organizations around the world. And I think as organizations try to put together value propositions that distinguish themselves so that they can get the right talent that they need, they should start thinking about providing the opportunity for training and development, perhaps even as an employee benefit, employee benefit around the world.
And in the 1950s and 60s in the United States and in many other countries, it's still the case. Corporations really felt a responsibility to employees who came on. The idea was if you do a good job, you will be with us for life. We will continue to retrain you. Then, especially in the United States, over the past 30 to 40 years, we've had a big shift to what might be described as shareholder capitalism. The only thing that matters is the bottom line. Your career is your problem. We will be happy to have your services when they benefit us, but the moment they don't, goodbye, you can work somewhere else. Guy and Bill, do you want to weigh in on what, as we shift to this, and as the world, as we become much more focused on stakeholder capitalism, where every company that I've heard speak here is saying that its customers are asking, what are you doing for the world, not just your shareholders? What is the responsibility? Talk to that. And how do we take people from, sorry, your job is going to be automated, into this new future?
Should I go first? Yeah, I think the key to this debate, I mean, we're all agreed that there's going to be an enormous need for reskilling, getting people from the jobs where they are today to where they're going to be tomorrow.
Now, South Africa's drought enters a fourth year. A recent survey by the industry body Agri-SA found that in the past year, the industry has lost 31,000 jobs and $510 million in potential revenue. In just one sector, the ostrich industry, a decline of nearly 20% of national flock has been witnessed. Joining me on this is Absa Bank economist Wessel Lemmer, and welcome, Wessel. Just walk us through some of the numbers that we are seeing here. First, projections of close to 31,000 jobs lost. Tell me, is this a number that you can actually justify on your end?
Well, it's a number that Agri-SA gave through, so you have to use them as a source to verify that number. What you come back to the ostrich industry, the ostrich industry is in a quite predicament. Although the ostrich industry is a small industry compared to the total gross producer value of South Africa, it's very relevant to that specific area in the Klein Karoo, because those farmers and the workers don't really have an alternative when they're not able to farm with ostriches. And there's certain challenges that the ostrich industry has. It has to do with the drought, but there's also two other factors that actually lead to the banning of exports of ostrich meat to the EU, which is quite significant, has a significant impact on the industry, but we can talk further about that.
But that's actually something that's very interesting. You can just shed some more light on this. Have there been some markets that have come through and actually been able to take whatever excess that was supposed to be exported to the EU? Have there been some export potentials that have propped up in the past few years?
You see, the thing is that when you look at the income that the producer gets from a bird, ostrich, it's actually a very interesting farming enterprise, because you get income from the feathers, which is going to Brazil to these carnivals and even to the east. So, and feather prices is actually increasing at the moment. It looks not that bad. But then you have also leather, the leather from the ostrich. You have these leather handbags and nice stuff that ladies like. So you have, and that market's also, the price is picking up. But then, very importantly also, you have the meat. Now, from those three, you have three different income streams. And if you don't have the meat, you actually are, you need to slaughter the ostrich to get the leather. You don't need them to slaughter to get the feather, but you need to do that. And if you don't have a market, and our main market, and because ostrich meat is such a very healthy meat in terms of cholesterol, there's a big demand for it in the EU. But there's certain aspects that actually keep our ostrich industry prisoner. Now, the one thing is, how did it come about that we don't export meat? We don't export meat because of the previous year, the presence of bird flu, H5N8. It's a dangerous strain. Now, that is something of the past. So there's some concerns from Dove that is maybe there's other strains, not that serious, but that's not the issue. So the H5N8 strain is not present in South Africa, so that is passed. The next thing is in terms of minimum residue levels for the exports of meat. There's certain issues on that, but that is also resolved, and there's also the EU actually approved those. But the thing that is most important, and that actually put our industry in a predicament, is that we need to protect our poultry industry and our pork industry from imports from the EU. And the prevalence of bird flu or avian influenza in the EU, we don't allow the imports of those into South Africa. Now, if you want to allow that, what the EU is telling you is, well, you don't want us to export poultry to South Africa, we're not going to import any ostrich meat. And I think that is where the crucial part is.
Wessel, very, very briefly before I let you go, is the categorization of ostrich as game as opposed to livestock. And this poses many questions. In future, do you see a sort of a reform that could have the two work hand in hand together?
Yeah, but I don't think that will solve the problem of the ostrich industry. But you need to have those market access to the EU, because about all our ostrich meat goes to the EU, whether if it's game or if it's a livestock. Poultry is also livestock, and we don't import it from the EU because of the presence of H5N8 still in the EU. So that's actually the thing. So what the EU currently needs, what they want to do is they want to regionalize, to say, listen, we know bird flu or avian influenza is present in the total EU, but we would like to allow from a certain disease-free region to export it to South Africa, and that's where Brexit comes in. So if you don't have, if Brexit goes through and you have Britain with a different bilateral agreement with South Africa, it may be possible that we still can export to Britain, but not to the EU.
Wessel, lots to talk about, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Many thanks to Wessel there joining us from APSA. Let's take a short break, but coming up right after that, our guests do discuss the health of Africa's democracies after this. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now, democracy is increasingly under threat across the continent, from unashamed vote rigging, brutal crackdowns on opposition parties, censorship, and internet shutdowns. Joining me now to discuss the health of democracy on the continent is in the Johannesburg studio, Afro expert and a legal practitioner, Tapiwa Diamond, and in London, Sub-Saharan African analyst and emerging market advisory firm, Frontier Strategy Group, Matthew Kindinger. Gentlemen, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let me start with you, Tapiwa. Election year, we could go on from Senegal to South Africa. Tell me, which election are you actually looking out for the most?
It was the ones in the DRC, the ones which we just went past, and obviously, of course, the ones in Zimbabwe.
Right, Matthew, good to have you on the show again. Just give me a sense of DRC. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad was it?
Well, I would hesitate to add a number to how bad the election was, but I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of irregularities in the election. There has been a lot of disagreement over who is actually the ultimate winner of the election, and this does cause problems in terms of the legitimacy of Mr. Tshisekedi's rule going forwards.
Tapiwa, more on this DRC election. On one end, we had some African presidents saying, you know what, it was a good election, it went well. On the other end, we had some observers coming out citing irregularities, as Matthew has mentioned. Where did you put it as an outsider who's looking at this very candidly?
Well, looking into the African discourse as far as elections are concerned, it has never been a perfect and smooth sail. We have seen that elections in Africa are always not a free and fair encounter, but it is a free and fair encounter. So we have seen what has been happening in the DRC, you know, and yes, there was violence. Yes, there were irregularities in the country. But if you look at the history of the country, we would see that this was the first time where there was a transition of power bloodless transition of power, so to say. And irrespective of other people not being able to vote because of Ebola, because of the attacks, and all other reasons which have been put on the table by international and local observers and non-governmental organizations which are pro-democracy. But the good thing is, as we speak, there is a little bit of democracy in the DRC, and we hope and pray that things continue to go on forward peacefully for the political, social, and economic development of the country.
Matthew, is this what it has actually come down to? Kind of having a situation where you're saying, you know what, it was bad, but it could be worse?
Well, I think it is true that this is a step in the right direction for the DRC. This invariably does show that there is a movement towards a more democratic tradition in the country. However, I think one thing we must remember is that the country does face significant challenges. The question that I have in my mind and we have here at Frontier Strategy Group is what the new president will do to improve stability, deal with unrest in the country, but also attract investors.
Right, let's move on to another juggernaut on the continent, Nigeria, of course, the most populous country across Africa. And this is going to be very interesting because the incumbent Buhari has thrown his hat in the bag there. But the populist movements coming up here and there. Tell me, what do you make of the campaigns right now and some of the people who've actually come forth for the poll?
Nigeria is one of the biggest country in Africa, and it's a huge economy that we have in Nigeria. We've got oil and a lot of deposits in the country. Buhari does stand a great chance. That is irrespective and despite of the fact that he has not been in the country for the better part of his terms, because he's been in London getting medical attention. He has not been a present president in the country. But look, the opposition parties currently, when you look at the candidates who are there, they've not been uniting and fighting towards one goal. They've got one common enemy in Nigeria, who is Buhari. But they are then so different in their ideologies and the way they're approaching the election. And that could then in turn have negative effects to them in terms of fighting against Buhari.
Matthew, an elephant in the room when it comes to the Buhari presidency is this is a person who in the 80s was known as a strong man, a strong general, and when he came in power, his second tenure, it was made very clear that you need an army man, you know, the likes of Babangida, to come in there and take out Boko Haram. A few years later, this hasn't been done. Do you get a sense that this is going to be something that is curtailed by his opposition and his running mates, well, the opposition, to say that, you know what, you failed on Boko Haram?
He did win some popularity in the first couple of years of his most recent term by counteracting the effects of Boko Haram. But in recent months, over the last 6 months, there has been an increase in Boko Haram activity, and this could undermine his legitimacy, but also reduce his chances of being re-elected.
Right, an interesting election, if we're to go to Francophone Africa, is Senegal. Tell me, is this one that you've actually been looking out for? There's already reports coming through of some journalists not having as much access to the electorate as they might. What are you making of the lead up to the Senegalese election so far?
We can never look at the Francophone countries alone, as a standalone. As we look at Senegal, all the same time, on the same token, also have to look at the Cameroon elections. That the issues which are happening in Cameroon have been the very same issues that have been happening in Senegal. Those who are in power are corrupt, and they've been doing whatever they can do to hold on to power. There's been an eradication. I mean, there's been a lot of issues that the opposition parties have been citing and raising, but those issues have not been raised. But then it goes on to say, as Francophone countries, is there unity within those countries? Do you understand? I believe fighting towards one goal, that is what has been lacking in Africa. The African Union, the United Nations, they have got an arm's length relationship with the real issues in Africa. And the political leaders, when they get into power, they all just want to cling on to power, and they've got nothing to do with the upliftment of the society.
Tapiwa, before you came in, actually, I thought you were Francophone yourself. You know, you're just like a laissez-faire. You know, I could have sworn you're from Francophone Africa. But Matthew, let's talk about the Senegalese part of the equation here. It's quite interesting because Macky Sall during his tenure, oil is discovered in the country, and there are reports that this could actually be extracted by 2021. And this election is kind of standing in the way of all of this. Do you get the sense that this is a it's a foregone deal, and Macky Sall is going to be re-elected?
Yes, to a large extent, it's most likely that Mr. Sall will be re-elected, and this is largely because his opposition candidates or the opposition parties have been sidelined in the election. It looks like he is attempting to win re-election so that he can benefit from the beginning of oil production, which will have a positive economic effect on the country.
And an unconfirmed report, maybe you could just touch more on this, is that there have been reports of, again, journalists and maybe some opposition parties being clamped down when it comes to expression. Is this something you've actually heard going around?
So this is not something that I could confirm or I could comment on, but I would say that the fact that the opposition candidates have been effectively barred from running in the presidential election does mean that we are expected to see a bit more social unrest and social tension in Senegal over the next few months and through 2019.
Tapiwa, is this actually the theme for African elections? You know, if there's a strong candidate, we saw it in the Congo, Jean-Pierre Bemba, and as an opposition candidate being barred from running. Of course, Moise Katumbi also barred from running. This was strong opposition candidates. And is this a theme when it comes to African elections? It's one thing to run an election, but your strongest opponents, you know, leave them out of the ballot paper.
So the African leaders, if you are the referee, the match official, and the player, you are bound to make rules as you go. So democracy applies in Africa mutatis mutandis, with necessary personal changes. You know, so those in power, from Cape to Cairo, all over Africa, we have seen the trend that the presidents, the incumbent, would always do whatever it is possible for them within their powers, within their means, to silence down, to clamp down any challenge and any opposition presidential candidates. We saw in the DRC, they were bad. And we saw that irrespective of how they tried to voice their concerns and say, we have the capacity. They did not have enough machinery. Opposition parties don't have enough machinery to challenge those who are in power, because those who are in power have got all the armory within them. They've got the bigger voice. They've got the state media to control as well. So whatever propaganda that comes out is just there to benefit those who are sitting.
Tapiwa, you've raised a very strong point there. Matthew, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Many incumbents across the continent, they're the judge, they're the jury, they're the executioner, they're the janitor. To what extent is African democracy moving forward kind of reminiscent on the Gambian election, where we saw, well, we're all very surprised when Yahya Jammeh was ousted by Adama Barrow, you know, and the Electoral Commission actually said the opposition candidate is the winner. To what extent is this actually a strong indicator moving forward?
Well, I would say that the last couple of years has shown that a number of governments, or a number of governments in power, have attempted to remain in power. And I would say that there's been a trend that they've become a bit more sophisticated in trying to maintain their positions of power. Unfortunately, there hasn't really been a movement towards more democratic changes. I would say there are a couple of exceptions. Ghana is a very good exception, a good example of a country where there is a very strong democratic tradition in the country that has been established. But overall, there hasn't been a sign over the last few years that there is likely to be more democratic transitions on the continent.
Gentlemen, before I let you go, this is a debate that I have held a lot of times. On one end, you have a developmental state, Ethiopia, China, Singapore. On one end, on the other hand, you have a democratic state, you know, South Africa's of this world, and Ghana, which actually stands out when it comes to the democratic index across sub-Saharan Africa. Tommy, let me start with you, Tapiwa. For Africa to develop, what would you say is a good prescription? Because we've seen the developmental state model work in Singapore, in China, Ethiopia, you know, yes, Ethiopia, let me leave it there for now. Yes. What would be a good prescription here?
Well, what I've seen in Africa is that I read a book which primarily was focusing on SADC. The book was saying towards a democratic development of states in Southern Africa. What then it focuses on was specifically on the African countries to say, when the governments took over, when they took power, have then done much now in terms of going forward with democracy. But we have seen that those who are in power, Africa has actually been regressing. Right. And there is a need for governments who are pro-democratic and wants to build the nations together with the people moving forward.
Tapiwa, let me just put a pause on that. Matthew, parting shots, democratic or developmental?
I would definitely say that in the long term, a democratic model is really beneficial for overall levels of economic growth. You can look at countries like Sudan, Cameroon. They have strong men in power. They're authoritarian states, effectively, and there are rising levels of social unrest and tension. So invariably, democratic reforms, high levels of governance standards are beneficial, especially for investor sentiment and for overall levels of economic development.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time that we did have for this particular one. Many thanks for my panelists, and that's where we'll leave it for this Capital Connection. Thank you to my guests again, and do join us again for more Capital Connection every Monday and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. From us, have a good night.